Searching for coastal perfection in 45 minutes with Escape to the Country. Before that on BBC One Scotland, the latest from Holyrood and Westminster in Politics Scotland with Andrew Kerr.
On Politics Scotland this afternoon. The Supreme Court delivers a decisive judgment on whether the Scottish Parliament has the power to hold a referendum on independence.
The Scottish Parliament does not have the power to legislate for a referendum on Scottish independence.
The First Minister says the next general election will be a de facto referendum on independence, accusing the UK government of denying democracy.
And here at Westminster, we'll be assessing what happens next.
Hello and welcome to the programme. It was Judgment Day and the Supreme Court ruled the Scottish Parliament does not have the power to hold a second referendum on independence. The five-strong panel of judges said the Scottish Government could not organise another vote without the consent of the UK Government. Here's the Court's President delivering the ruling.
The effects of legislation for the purpose of deciding whether it relates to a reserved matter are not confined to its legal effects, but include its practical effects. A lawfully held referendum would have important political consequences relating to the Union and the United Kingdom Parliament. It's therefore clear that the proposed bill has more than a loose or consequential connection with the reserved matters of the Union of Scotland and England and the sovereignty of the United Kingdom Parliament. The Court unanimously concludes that the proposed bill does relate to reserved matters. Accordingly, in the absence of any modification of the definition of reserved matters by an order in Council under Section 30 of the Scotland Act or otherwise, the Scottish Parliament does not have the power to legislate for a referendum on Scottish independence.
Now, the reaction to the judgment came quickly with Nicola Sturgeon holding a press conference in Edinburgh, saying the next general election will indeed be a de facto referendum. The Prime Minister spoke in the House of Commons, saying he respects the decision of the court and will work constructively with the Scottish Government. The Scottish Secretary echoed that.
It is important now that we move on from constitutional issues to focus on tackling our shared challenges. I therefore welcome the Supreme Court judgment and I call on the Scottish Government to set aside these divisive constitutional issues so that we can work together, focusing all of our attention and resources on the key issues that matter to the people of Scotland.
Unless we give up on democracy, and again, for the avoidance of any doubt, I, for one, am simply not prepared to do that. We must and we will find another democratic, lawful and constitutional means by which the Scottish people can express their will. In my view, that can only be an election.
Well, I'm joined now by our political reporter, Jenny Davison. Jenny, good afternoon to you. Quite a day in Scottish politics, isn't it? Really significant day. What happens next, do you think? We heard Nicola Sturgeon just setting out some of her thinking just there.
Yes, a very significant day indeed, Andrew. And yes, we heard Nicola Sturgeon setting out that for her the next step is probably using the next general election as what she's calling a de facto referendum. Now, fair to say this isn't her top choice. It's probably her least favourite option. She would have preferred, she's been clear, the number one choice would have been for the UK government and still is for the UK government to agree to a referendum. The same has happened in 2014. Plan B, that's now been ruled out by the court. The Scottish Parliament simply going ahead with an advisory referendum itself. Plan C is this now using an election as a kind of referendum, but a number of issues around that. I mean, obviously, she's talked about there's going to be discussions early next year about the detail of how that would work and probably what the thresholds would be and things like that. But of course, the difficulty of other issues coming into a general election B, of getting that threshold if it's, say, 50% of the vote. Very difficult for the SNP as one party to get 50% of the vote in the general election. And C, would the UK government accept the general election being a de facto referendum and respect any result, even if they did get that vote?
Indeed, and some more dilemmas for the UK government, which we'll pick up on a bit later in the programme. But just staying with Nicola Sturgeon's strategy at the moment, it was some have described it as quite a brave move, an interesting move, even a clever move, kind of picking that route. Was it a wise move, perhaps? Some have been questioning.
It was very risky. I mean, it's fair to say she didn't have a lot of great options open to her, that the UK government perhaps held most of the cards anyway, and she had to do something to move things along. But yes, a couple of problems with them referring this themselves to the Supreme Court. Perhaps it might have been stronger if they'd actually gone ahead and passed the legislation, passed a bill, and then the UK government had taken them to court, just the perception of that. But a couple of issues going forward. Well, this doesn't just stop this current Parliament or this current government from bringing legislation to the Scottish Parliament. This now closes it down forever for all future governments, future parliaments, future MSPs. No one can now put this through the Scottish Parliament unless there's a change to the Scotland Act. Secondly, as I said, the UK government probably already held a stronger hand, but now, of course, it's even stronger because it's absolutely clear that the Scottish government, the Scottish Parliament cannot act alone without its agreement. So there's kind of even less pressure on the UK government to change its mind and agree to a referendum, because it knows there's no other route open to the Scottish government at the moment. OK, Jenny, thank you very much. We'll be picking up with you a bit later on, as I said. Thank you. Let's drill down now in the judgment from the court with some legal experts. I'm joined now by Linda Towers, Director of Public Law at the legal firm Morton Fraser, and Stephen Tierney, Professor of Constitutional Theory at Edinburgh University's Law School, both of whom have advised governments and Parliament on referendums and constitutional matters. Good afternoon to both of you. Thank you very much for joining me. Let's pick up with you first, Linda, and just get your initial reaction to the judgment. Were you surprised in any way, shape or form by what Lord Reid was delivering there?
I think I was surprised that it was delivered as quickly as it was, bearing in mind how comprehensive the judgment was in the matter that it's dealt with. I think the issue as to whether or not the court were prepared to hear the judgment was never absolutely clear. So it was quite surprising how firm they were on that, and that matters were not either premature or hypothetical. The second half of the judgment was perhaps more of an exercise that was perhaps less surprising if you were taking a narrow interpretation of the Scotland Act, but it's still very, very useful in now having clarity, and it's now taken 23 years, if you like, to get there.
And Linda, if you had been the Lord Advocate, if you had been in the position of Dorothy Bain, would you have pursued this strategy, do you think?
I think she clearly had misgivings about whether or not the bill was within legislative competence. And this was a novel way to have it addressed by the Supreme Court. And it's clear from the judgment that the Supreme Court do not consider that was an inappropriate way forward. So I think the Lord Advocate, in the situation she was in, was perhaps taking a novel way to go forward, but it was not something which was unreasonable in the circumstances, and the judgment bears that out.
And Professor Stephen Tierney, there had been an awful lot of speculation before the judgment that it might be slightly fudged. Some had called it even a possible fudgment, that it might not be as crystal clear, but it was very clear and decisive. Were you probably expecting that? Some have said, well, actually the law is very clear.
I think it's interesting, as Linda says, that the court dealt with the procedural question and said, we can definitely call this in. There's a public interest matter at stake. What's also interesting is that the decision is unanimous. The court did prioritise this decision. That's why it came to the decision so quickly. A lot of people thought it would be next year. The judgment is quite short in terms of legal judgments. They're often very long. This is quick, short and clear, and I would say unequivocal. So as far as a clear decision on the matter that people have been debating for so long, you're absolutely right. There's no fudging around this. It's 100% clear. There's no power to do this.
And Stephen, the justices also picked up on the submission made by the SNP in referring to the Quebec question and any recourse to international law, but was saying that people in Scotland are not colonised or oppressed. Were you perhaps surprised that they decided to pick up so decisively on that issue as well?
I was, because in a sense, they said, look, the union is reserved, so is a referendum on the union, because a referendum has effects. That would have done the job, as it were. The Quebec case is interesting because the Canadian Supreme Court was asked, can Quebec secede as a matter of international law? Can it secede as a matter of constitutional law? And the Canadian Supreme Court dealt with the international law question very quickly by saying the right to secession under international law, the right to break up a state, only applies in situations of decolonisation or severe oppression. And there's no question that Quebec is in that situation. And to be fair to the Quebec nationalists, they never made the claim that they were. So it is interesting the court decides to draw that analogy. And it does so really, I think, to hammer home the point that there is no avenue to revisit this.
And Linda, of course, that's interesting, no avenue to revisit this. What was the purpose, do you think, of the justices really picking up on that and the effect that could have? Was that an attempt by the justices to shut down that route, perhaps?
I think what the justices were doing in this case was saying that the current case has been decided in accordance with the previous cases that have looked at how the Scotland Act operates and attempts to be more specific about some of the provisions of the Act. I think what the court is saying now is no, we've looked at this, we've thought about the various aspects of it, and we are quite clear that a referendum does infringe those two particular provisions relating to the Union and sovereignty of Parliament, as they call it in the UK. And I think this judgment is pretty clear as to the outcome of all of the various past cases, and have been distinguished in such a way that these cases are now a persuasive and binding line of cases on how this is to be dealt with.
And Stephen, we heard from the First Minister at her press conference in Edinburgh talking about that de facto referendum being the next general election. When it comes to a legal point on this, say the SNP did get more than 50%, or pro-independence parties did get more than 50% of the vote, what legal effect would that have, if any? What might the UK government say to that and have any legal recourse, in a sense?
Yeah, in legal terms, it would have no effect. The union is a reserved matter, and it's not something that can be broken up by way of a general election within Scotland. It's also, I think, quite hard to characterise a general election as a referendum. Referendums and elections are categorically different electoral processes. In one, people are asked one individual question, and they understand that the outcome of that vote will be decisive on that one particular question. An election, of course, is a much more complicated process where you're electing people indirectly to then make certain decisions, and they stand on a range of manifesto commitments. So as a matter of category distinction, it's very difficult to characterise an election as a referendum. So it will be interesting to see what the plan is on that.
And Linda, another thing to fall out of this as well, in a sense, was the SNP saying, well, actually, in a sense, that Scotland is trapped in this undemocratic prison with no way out of what has been called a voluntary union. Could there be a way out legally? Of course, we've seen in the Good Friday Agreement arrangements for a border poll, but then, of course, that it's not entirely clear in the Good Friday Agreement what those arrangements might be. What might be the trigger point for that kind of border poll? Could there be anything similar for Scotland?
Well, there certainly isn't at the moment in the Scotland Act at all. Obviously, any amendment to the Scotland Act would have to be made by the UK government to set a provision for making a referendum in future. So it would have to be their decision that would happen. And I think that's probably pretty unlikely at the moment, certainly. The Section 30 order provision is always open should the UK government decide that they wish to take a different route. And that's a lot easier, obviously, than amending the Scotland Act or trying to make provision for referendums in the future in particular circumstances like Northern Ireland. That was a very particular provision, bearing in mind the historical arrangements from Northern Ireland.
So, Stephen, bearing that point in mind, just finally, is there a way out of the union then in a legal sense, bearing in mind what Linda has said?
The opportunity is simply to seek through political persuasion to persuade the UK Parliament to amend the Scotland Act to permit a referendum on that question. That's entirely within the keeping now, as we have now had clarified. It's entirely within the keeping of the authority of the UK Parliament, but that would be the only legal route.
OK, well, Professor Stephen Tierney and Linda Towers, thank you both very much for giving up your time and being with us on the programme today. Good to hear from you both. Thank you. Well, let's get the latest now from our Westminster correspondent, David Porter, who's standing by outside the Houses of Parliament. And David, really such a significant day for Scottish politics here. And you've been catching up with some of the reaction at Westminster. This has now moved from the legal sphere back very firmly into the political sphere, hasn't it?
Yes, it has, Andrew, and I think it is worth pointing that up, that we have some legal clarity, some legal certainty, because it was a unanimous decision by the justices of the Supreme Court. But it doesn't really change the core politics of all this. As we know, the fault line of Scottish politics is the question of the Constitution and whether there should be another independence referendum. Before today, the UK government was saying, no, we're not going to have another referendum, not time for it at the moment. As we know, the Scottish government say they want a second independence referendum. The law officers and the Supreme Court have clarified that today, but the politics has not really changed. But that does not mean that today has not been very significant. We had the judgment just before 9:45 this morning, immediate reaction from SNP MPs who'd gathered outside the Supreme Court. They said they were disappointed, but they were not surprised. From the unionist side of the argument, they said they were not surprised and they were very pleased with the way things had gone. They say it is now time to move on, perhaps for the bread and butter issues of all politics, things like cost of living at the moment. And that has very much been the theme of the unionist argument in what is in effect a mini debate we've had in the House of Commons this lunchtime, a so-called urgent question from the SNP leader Ian Blackford on the Supreme Court ruling. He wanting sort of clarity from the UK government as to what happens next. Unionist politicians saying, OK, look, we have this legal clarity. Let's park that now. Let's concentrate on the two governments working today. Today is, of course, Wednesday here at Westminster. Normally, the focus of events is Prime Ministers, clashes between the Prime Minister and the leader of the opposition. By coincidence today, just the way the ballot for questions went, 6 SNP MPs had questions at Prime Minister's Question Time to Rishi Sunak. No prizes for guessing what they wanted to go on.
Democracy will not be denied, because whether Westminster likes it or not, last year the people of Scotland voted for a Scottish Parliament with a majority and the mandate to deliver an independence referendum. The Prime Minister has every right to oppose independence. He has no right to deny democracy to the people of Scotland. If the Prime Minister keeps blocking that referendum, will he at least be honest and confirm that the very idea that the United Kingdom is a voluntary union of nations is now dead and buried?
I think that the people of Scotland want us to be working on fixing the major challenges that we collectively face, whether that's the economy, supporting the NHS, or indeed supporting Ukraine. Now is the time for politicians to work together, and that's what this government will do.
Ian Blackford. Mr. Speaker, it is right that we respect the decision of the court. But the Prime Minister can't claim to respect the rule of law and then deny democracy in the very same breath. If democracy is to matter, if elections matter, then mandates matter. Since 2014, the Scottish National Party has won 8 elections in a row. Last year, we won a landslide. The Scottish Parliament now has the biggest majority for an independence referendum in the history of devolution. The Prime Minister doesn't even have a personal mandate to sit in 10 Downing Street. What right does a man with no mandate have to deny Scottish democracy?
But, Mr. Speaker, when it comes to Scottish democracy, I'm pleased that the Scottish Government has one of the most powerful devolved assemblies anywhere in the world. And I'm pleased, and I was pleased, very shortly after becoming Prime Minister, to be the first Prime Minister in over a decade to attend the Council, to sit down with the First Minister, to explore ways in which we can work together with the Scottish Government to deliver for the people of Scotland. Whether that's delivering our growth deals, delivering free ports, or ensuring that the £1.5 billion of extra Barnett money can go towards supporting public services, that's what we're committed to doing in Scotland.
The disaster that is Brexit was forced on Scotland against our will, and we see devolution wound back by legislation such as the Internal Market Act. So if the Prime Minister still claims the UK is a voluntary union, can he explain the democratic route by which the people of Scotland get to make a choice over their own future?
Well, Mr. Speaker, the UK is a collaborative and constructive union that is delivering for the people of Scotland. Even in Ayrshire itself, where we're working collaboratively with the Scottish Government to invest in aerospace, advanced manufacturing and space. Those are the types of activities that will bring tangible benefit to the people in her region, and that's the right focus for the Government.
Mr. Speaker, did Scotland vote for Brexit? No. Did Scotland vote for austerity?
No.
Did Scotland vote for the Tories?
No.
What we did vote for, don't shout me down, don't shout me down, I've listened to all of you. What we did vote for only last year was the right to choose our own future. With that in mind, and given a previous non-answer from the Prime Minister, can the Prime Minister tell this House, tell us all in fact, how a nation can leave this so-called voluntary union?
Mr. Speaker, the challenges that we face right now are those that require cooperation between our governments, tackling the economy, supporting the NHS, and I'm pleased that last week's autumn statement means that the Scottish Government will receive £1.5 billion in extra funding to deliver for public services in Scotland, and that's what we will continue doing.
Theresa May.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Scotland is a proud nation with a unique heritage. It is a valued member of our family of nations, a union of people bound through the generations by shared interests. Does my right honourable friend agree with me that this morning's Supreme Court decision gives the Scottish nationalists, the SNP, the opportunity for once to put the people of Scotland first? And end its obsession with breaking us apart.
I think that my right honourable friend put it very well, Mr. Speaker.
Prime Minister's question time from a little earlier today. Back here at Westminster, I'm pleased to say I'm joined by 4 MPs to discuss what, in anyone's terms, is pretty significant here at Westminster. First of all, let me introduce you to our guest, Annalise Dodds for the Labour Party, Christine Jardine for the Liberal Democrats, David Duckett for the Conservatives, and John Nicholson for the SNP. It'll be an opening question to all of you, the obvious question. Your reaction to what the Supreme Court has ruled today. John, first you.
Well, I wasn't especially surprised by it, and of course it's got to be remembered that the Supreme Court doesn't make law, it merely interprets law. But we are in an interesting position, aren't we? Because politicians cross-party for decades have told us that we're in a voluntary union, we can leave at any time. The Prime Minister himself confirmed this, the leader of the Labour Party confirmed it. But how do we do it? If we can't hold a referendum to leave the union, what is the physical process by which we leave the union? And I haven't yet been able to find amongst any of my political friends in other parties what the answer to that question is.
Some of your colleagues, SNP colleagues at Westminster, are suggesting Nicola Sturgeon should take the initiative. She can say, before we have a UK general election, if I'm going to say that the next election is going to be de facto on independence, I will call a Holyrood election early, and that might help settle the matter.
I've heard that, but you'll remember the last Holyrood election, every single political party went into the election saying that it was a referendum on independence because we would then hold a referendum. In fact, the leader of the Conservative Party, Douglas Ross, said on the day of the election, be in no doubt, if you go out and vote for the SNP today, you're voting for a referendum on independence. He's on tape saying it, and we have a majority in Parliament for that. So what does a majority in Parliament mean if Scottish Parliament votes for it and Westminster says no?
Let me widen this out. David Duckett, if there is another election, does that become de facto referendum, and does that play to your advantage, or does it play to the nationalist advantage?
On that particular question, that's not generally how general elections work. But if I can respond to John's point about what was put on election leaflets in the last, whether it's the last Holyrood election or last general election, of course, we in the opposition parties to the SNP are always going to say we're going to fight against another independence referendum, because that's not what the majority of people in Scotland want. It doesn't mean that when we don't win that election, then you automatically get the right for an independence referendum.
So you lose, but you don't really lose.
No, but that's not what it wasn't a referendum. It was an election. This is the whole point. Leave? Well, if I just answer the question, the constitutional question is that, or the democratic question, the democracy denial question, is elections work totally differently from referendums. You cannot take the result in terms of numbers of seats from an independence, from a general election, Freudian slip there, and convert that into the outcome of a supposed independence referendum. That's just not how democracy
Christy Jardine, are you worried that for the next couple of years, at least, that this issue is not going to be put to bed?
Frustrated rather than worried, because my mailbox every day does not reflect what the SNP constantly say in that chamber. Today we had to listen to just to think about every SNP MP stand up and say, oh, we should have a referendum now, we have a mandate. First of all, they don't have a majority of people in Scotland. The majority did not vote for the SNP or a combination of the SNP and Greens. So what I worry about is that we are not going to tackle the issues that are important to the people of Scotland, and that's the cost of living crisis, the price of energy, everything that's coming down the line as a result of the pandemic, the war in Ukraine. That's what people write to me about, what they are concerned about. They're not interested in independence. Perhaps at some other time they might be, but right now they don't want to talk about that.
Annalise Dodds, from your knowledge of Scotland, we know amongst some groups the constitutional question is important, but are people concerned about bread and butter issues at the moment?
Well, people are really worried in some cases about whether they're going to be able to afford to heat their home or to actually provide food for themselves and their kids. That's the reality in a lot of Scotland at the moment. And to be honest, that cost of living crisis and the NHS crisis and the crime crisis and the education crisis in Scotland, they're not being dealt with well by a Conservative government in Westminster, but they're not being dealt with very well, I have to say, by an SNP government in Holyrood either. We need to have real, genuine change. The genuine change will come with a Labour government, and that's why it was so disappointing to hear Nicola Sturgeon immediately out of the blocks today saying what she's going to focus on for the next general election again is going to be constitutional questions, not those really big issues about the changes that Scottish people really need.
John Nicholson, your critics say that actually this is the ultimate distraction politics, that you should be concentrating on those so-called bread and butter issues, the health service, education and things like that.
It is enormously patronising for politicians to tell the electorate what they should be concerned with.
Stop doing it then.
The electorate, well,
you're telling us.
you guys haven't won. You guys haven't won an election in Scotland since
More
the
votes between us than you guys.
Since the 1950s.
More people
we
vote
fought
together than vote for you.
One at a time. I know you all sing from the same hymn sheet, but one at a time. We won an election last year, and I noticed that the three of them have failed to answer the question that I posed right at the start. How do we get to leave this voluntary union? We're not allowed to do it through an election. We've just been told we're not allowed to have a referendum. The reason they don't want a referendum is because they know they would lose. Otherwise, they would have one tomorrow.
David Duckett, so you, as a unionist politician, according to John Nicholson,
the last thing I want, and I believe the last thing Scotland wants, Scottish society, Scottish business, Scottish economy, the last thing we need or want is an independence referendum. But I've got absolutely no doubt in my mind if we were to have one, the same result would come through, which is why we shouldn't be having one. We'd be banging ourselves against the walls, going round in circles, causing social and economic damage for no good reason.
Christine Jardine, you could put the question, if you are so confident you, the unionists, are going to win, go ahead and call their bluff.
Well, we had a referendum in 2014 and 45% only voted for independence.
And then there was Brexit.
47% voted at the last general election, which frankly, John, came after Brexit, if you remember. So the majority of people in Scotland are not crying out for an independence referendum, and it's our job to listen to the people of Scotland when they write to us and say, we want our government to fix the NHS, we want our government to do something about the schools, we want our government to do something about the record drugs deaths. That's what people are telling us. And that's what we're listening to, because that is what the people of Scotland want.
How do
the
we
majority of them, well,
by
Scotland
consensus.
would leave at the point when you had a
How do you test
consensus
that?
and a majority, and you don't have it.
We've got a majority in the Scottish Parliament, as you know.
Annalise
First past the
Dodds,
post.
that is a question. If Scotland does want to leave the UK, how does it do it? It has to do it through a referendum, doesn't it?
Well, obviously, I don't want to see that happening. I'd be really worried about the kind of swinging cuts we'd see to public services that are already on their knees in Scotland if we had, at the end of the day, for example, independence. But anyway, it's not what Scottish people want. I'm afraid it's just not right to say that there isn't evidence that Scottish people are saying now they don't want a referendum. Every opinion poll where people have been asked, do you want a referendum now? They show people don't want it now. They do want a government that actually will focus on those bread and butter issues.
His exact words were, ignore opinion polls. The only vote that counts is election vote. That's what the Scottish Labour leader said.
Sarwar, who's showing that we can deal with those challenges for Scotland. He's not running away from them.
You're
He's not
quoting opinion
blaming.
polls. He's saying ignore
He's
them.
not, with respect, he's not blaming other sides. He's getting a grip on these issues, and I've seen him doing that. I've seen him focusing, for example, on the high level of drug deaths that are the worst in Scotland, and saying we need to just stop blaming each other about this and get a grip. That's what Labour would do.
We will have to leave it there. Annalise Dodds, Christine Jardine, David Dugan and John Nicholson, thank you very much. You may have noticed, apart from the sirens that we always get, Andrew, that we've given you a slightly different shot today. Behind me, that wonderful statue, the burghers of Calais. There is also another reason. It is soaking wet here. This is the only bit of dry ground we can find.
Good to stay in the dry. David, thanks for a very lively discussion there. Thank you very much. Right, let's catch up with Jenny once again. Jenny, we referred to this earlier. We said we'd come to it. The MPs have been picking up on it about this voluntary union. The SNP say, how do you get out of it? And the pro-union parties are saying, well, the majority don't want out of it. This is the question that is going to really dominate political debate, I suppose, isn't it?
It's not going to go away. You're right. This is the other side I mentioned earlier, a lot of the difficulties now for the Scottish government. But the UK government is not without political difficulties around this issue either. I mean, we've heard both from Rishi Sunak earlier at Prime Minister's Questions and also from Keir Starmer a few weeks ago on the Sunday show that essentially they're saying, well, this isn't a priority. We should focus on the economy. We should focus on other issues like Ukraine just now. But ongoing, there's got to be an answer to this question. If it is a voluntary union, how can Scotland leave? If it wanted to leave, how do Scottish people ever vote on this again? And of course, at the moment, we've got this message, Theresa May's message, we saw her earlier, now's not the time. And there's also pointing back to, well, it's only 8 years since people voted on it. There's no reason to vote again. But over the longer term, this question of democracy denied could be a major political issue. It's not, you know, the question of independence isn't going to go away because of today's Supreme Court ruling. So what is the answer? And, you know, SNP MPs trying to get and didn't get an answer from Rishi Sunak today. What is the answer to that question of if Scotland wanted to leave, how could it?
OK, Jenny, thank you very much. Well, let's get some more answers. Time to cross to this week's lineup of MSPs from the Scottish Parliament. They are Miles Briggs from the Scottish Conservatives, Fiona Hislop from the SNP, Ross Greer from the Scottish Green Party and Labour's Pam Duncan-Glancy. Good afternoon to all of you. Thank you very much for joining me. Fiona Hislop, to you from the SNP. First of all, did you ever think you would win in court today? The law perhaps seemed pretty clear.
Well, the point of law has been clarified, but the point of democracy hasn't. And the people of Scotland's right to choose is still an unanswered question by the UK government. And people voted for a majority in the Scottish Parliament only last year, and we were crystal clear that we wanted to see a referendum. Indeed, the opposition, including the Conservatives, were crystal clear that they didn't want a referendum. So the right of the people of Scotland to determine their own future and the right to choose is centre stage and is not going anywhere. And the people of Scotland know that independence now can only be the option that would allow us to always get the governments that we vote for. And the challenges economically that we are facing just now are absolutely because we are not independent, and Brexit and a Conservative government that we didn't vote for has caused the difficulties we're facing. The sooner we can become independent, the better.
So is this a risky strategy now that the First Minister has embarked upon about a de facto referendum, a general election where you're hoping for a record number of votes and that would have actually probably no impact whatsoever?
I don't think it's ever a risk to ask the people of Scotland to choose their own future. Our preference clearly is a Section 30 order. The UK government could do that tomorrow if they so wished. But if we have to take this, and we will take this to a vote, another vote to the Scottish people, then I don't think that's a risk at all. Because unlike the opposition parties and the unionists, I do trust the people of Scotland to decide their own future.
But if you do get more than 50%, what actually happens? The UK government would just say, no, Scotland's not leaving the United Kingdom.
Well, I'll tell you, the eyes of the world will be looking on the UK government, and I think that the denial of democracy that I think is central to this argument is well and truly focused on them and their credibility in the eyes of the world. How can they lecture anybody about democracy and the rule of law if they don't comply with the right of the people of Scotland to decide? We just have to have the democratic moment that would allow that to happen. We're not stopping it. Why would the UK government stop the right of the people to decide their own future?
What Miles Briggs from the Conservatives, the UK government may be celebrating this win just now, but as Fiona Hislop is pointing out there, does this not leave you with a real difficulty in what has been described as a voluntary union? How can Scotland now ever leave? Is it a prisoner in this union?
No, and I don't think that sort of language helps, Andrew. And I think when you actually consider and respect democracy, let's go back to the 2014 referendum we had. The SNP 5 minutes after that have never respected the outcome of that referendum. I think that's wrong, and that brings us to where we are today in the overheated rhetoric we're seeing from all your SNP and Green commentators who are on television today. What we need to see is we need to move on from the divisions of the past, and I think that's where the majority of people in Scotland want to see that. What's important now, though, for the SNP and for the First Minister especially, is that she considers what this judgment means for Scotland, because they're on the wrong side of public opinion. There's not a majority wanting another referendum. And I hope, like Theresa May said in the House of Commons, this gives an opportunity for the First Minister to think about her own career, to think about actually where she needs to be focused on the issues that matter in Scotland, like health, education, all the things which are going wrong in our country today on her watch. That's what we should be talking about today, not another referendum. You talk about being on the wrong side of public opinion, but the polls seem quite evenly split at the moment. Could there not be some mechanism that we have? We touched on this on the programme earlier, like the same for Northern Ireland, in the Good Friday Agreement, something to trigger some kind of poll. If, you know, it's 60% in the polls consistently or something, would that not be some kind of safety valve, release valve to enable Scotland maybe to leave the Union? Well, I'm a unionist politician. I do not want another referendum. But at the heart of this is what was that process in 2011. That was a process all parties signed up to. We then took that forward collectively. Now, personally speaking, I think that was one of the hardest and most poisonous times in Scottish politics, that referendum. But that we put that to the people, they decided, and we decided as a nation to stay part of our United Kingdom. We now need to move on from this. And I think voters, be it at the next Westminster election or the next Holyrood election, they'll be the ones who decide to move on, and that will be rejecting the SNP. Well,
Pam Duncan-Glancy from the Labour Party, in essence, your leader has not taken on this question at all. Keir Starmer was in this very building, really not taking this on about Scotland essentially being trapped in the Union. It's exactly the same question to you. Should there be some kind of mechanism for Scotland to leave?
It's absolutely clear that the majority of people in Scotland want change, but the change that they want and need doesn't come with a referendum. The change they want and need comes with a Labour government, and only Labour can replace the Tories. That's what people in Scotland want. 750,000 people in Scotland are sitting on NHS waiting lists. 1 million people in Scotland are living in relative poverty. Energy bills are rising, and neither of the two governments that we have are doing enough to address it. That's what people want to change, not another referendum.
Well, I think the polls might suggest different. I mean, you're just hoping for a Labour government, but, a good chunk of people in Scotland are wanting independence.
I'm not sure that's the case. Less than a third of people want a referendum next year. And even when you ask people who do support independence, is now the time to have the referendum, they say no. So actually, what we are absolutely clear on is that people in Scotland need change. No wonder they're desperate for change when you look at the two governments they've got and the mess they've made of the economy, the mess they've made of the NHS, and the fact that they've not addressed child poverty here in Scotland properly. Those are the sorts of mandates that we need both of our governments to be addressing, not a referendum.
OK, well, Ross Greer from the Green Party, there's been a lot of talk today about a de facto referendum. How would that work for your party? What kind of talks will you have with the SNP about a future general election? Will you be standing Green MP candidates? Will your votes count towards what the SNP would say would be that majority to take us over the line?
The Greens have made clear that we intend to stand a full slate of candidates at the 2024 general election, and that every vote for every one of our candidates will count towards that majority for independence. We've been clear all along that that's not our preferred avenue for independence. Our preferred avenue is a referendum like we had in 2014. But today's been a pretty devastating day for the UK's reputation as a democracy, for its claim to be a voluntary union. Because the question now is not for the parties of independence, it's for the anti-independence parties. If they genuinely believe that this is a democracy, they need to explain why the people of Scotland aren't getting what they voted for last year, which is a referendum on independence. And if it's a voluntary union, they need to explain what their proposed mechanism is for allowing the people of Scotland to decide whether they want to stay in that union or to go. We believe in democracy in the Greens and in the SNP, and we won last year's election on absolutely clear manifesto commitments to give the people of Scotland this choice, because we believe that when you look at the absolute disaster that Westminster has been for our economy, when you look at the disaster it's been for our ability to tackle the climate crisis, the disaster it's been for poverty and inequality in this country, that we could do so much better if we put Scotland's future in Scotland's hands.
But is this not a pretty devastating day for your campaign, in a sense, a risky day as well? Because if you don't get that 50% at the next general election, then it is at the end of the independence campaign.
We're Democrats, and we've pursued every democratic opportunity to give the people of Scotland that choice. We were elected on manifesto commitments last year for a referendum. That referendum could have come about with the agreement of the UK government and a Section 30 order, just like we did in 2014. That clearly wasn't forthcoming, so we asked the Supreme Court that question, and the court agreed it was a valid question to ask. We obviously didn't get the answer to that we wanted. That's not something that should be laid at the feet of the Supreme Court for criticism. It's a matter of them judging on what the UK's current law is, and the law of the UK is a matter for the UK government and the UK Parliament. If they want to defend the UK's reputation as a democratic nation, as a voluntary union of four different places, they need to explain how we can exercise that democracy and exercise our right to self-determination, because people in Scotland clearly want to exercise that right. If they didn't want that, we wouldn't have been elected by majority last year, but we were.
OK, well, Ross Greer from the Scottish Green Party, Pam Duncan-Glancy from Scottish Labour, Fiona Hislop from the SNP and Miles Briggs from the Scottish Conservatives, thank you all very much for joining me on this very busy day in Scottish politics.
Thank you.
Let's have a final word with Jenny now. Jenny, we've got this judgment, of course, today, but there are other big issues going on in Scottish politics just now, including strike action that's coming up.
Indeed, yes. Tomorrow, teachers going on strike for the first time in a very long time. And then, of course, we have, various other sectors. We have postal workers, train workers, ambulance service. Next week, nurses still considering another pay offer. It's a very difficult time, both for workers in terms of having enough pay to make ends meet, but then those who are giving the pay offers being able to give the kind of offers they can afford, but yet are enough to prevent strike action. It's a very testing time all round. OK, Jenny, thanks very much for being with me here in the studios today. Thank you. And that's all we have time for today. Do join Kirsten Campbell for live coverage of First Minister's Questions tomorrow at noon over on the BBC Scotland channel this week. But thanks for being with us today on this important day. Bye-bye for now.